through causal loop diagrams. So I've asked you folks to, well, first of all, if there's anyone who is not receiving emails for this course that's here, please come up to me after lecture and make sure that I modify whatever I'm doing. I'm trying to send out information like about the video to be watched ahead of time, so it's important everyone's on the email address and email list and receives those emails. So for today, we're going to be talking about causal loop diagrams and their use in illustrating the structure of a system. So who here can describe to me what a causal loop diagram is? What is a causal loop diagram? What are these?
So we have attaching together different variables of a certain problem in a qualitative fashion that allows you to see feedbacks and identify some potential features that you might see over time.
Okay, good. So time behavior over time we refer to as dynamic behavior. It's behavior that dynamics and help us understand the structure of a system in terms of its dynamic behaviors. I'm not sure how centrally I brought it out in the lecture you would have watched, but why feedbacks? The feedbacks are just sort of one feature of many complex systems. Why does this method place such attention on feedback structure? You nailed it.
I watched the lecture.
Good. I guess the lecture nailed it. That's great. So feedbacks have an incredibly central role to play in governing the behavior of systems over time because they relate to the issue of stability and instability. Stability associated with sort of stasis, homeostasis, the thing that keeps our bodies in balance, keeps us well nourished, keeps us drinking water when we need to, getting sleep when we need to, etc. Regulatory processes on the one hand, and instability associated with rapid changes that allow for rapid adaptation to new situations, allow for taking advantage of new opportunities, but also pose risks. So let's explore these issues in a little bit more detail. So give me so what are some examples of feedback loops, or what are some types of feedback loops? How might we taxonomize feedback loops? We want to sort of list types of feedback loops without getting into all the details quite yet of what's in a particular feedback loop. What types might we list? Okay, 2 types. Yeah, great. And positive and negative. Okay, great. So a positive feedback. Well, maybe we'll just label these feedbacks. Yeah. Feedbacks. And we'll call one positive and one negative. Okay, so help me unpack these terms a little bit. Could I say a positive one is good and the negative one is bad? Is that what those terms mean? Okay, so what does it mean? What do I mean by positive feedback? Okay. Okay. A negative?
Yeah.
Or, okay. Negative has a balancing feature to it, so we might call these balancing loops. So the hallmark of them is a given change if you go in and change something at one point in the loop, change one of the factors, increases. In a negative feedback loop, what does that lead to? What comes about as a result that leads us to call it sort of negative? That change, if we increase one of the factors, so I increase my hunger, what happens as a result? So it ripples around a bunch of different factors. Maybe I increase my hunger, and so I get more interested in food, and so I go and I'm more likely to search out food and find food, and therefore to eat sooner, and therefore that tends to decrease my hunger. So it kicks off a bunch of changes that ultimately feed back and sort of push back against that original change. The original change was there, but these things that happen as a result kind of pull back against it. They resist that sort of initial impulse. So if I get thirsty, I go and get a drink. If I get tired, I go and sleep. Right? These are examples of physiological based ones. Hopefully we have these things not only at the individual level, but at the broader level, institutional level. Can anyone give me an example of this at an institutional level? A negative feedback? Okay.
I remember exactly thinking about policy making and making a new policy.
Okay.
And then it takes the effectiveness of that policy to see if it needs to be changed.
Okay.
There will be a negative transition there, and then that
Okay.
okay.
Okay. So with the policy, hopefully there's this kind of observe. You undertake some change. Let's suppose it has negative consequences. That will lead to observation of that. That will lead to rethinking it. It will lead to changing that policy in a way that will lessen how bad those effects were. Hopeful. Sometimes there's a long delay associated with that. We'll get into delays in a little bit. They're important. Okay, so negative loops have this kind of balancing quality to them. In original disturbance, it gets pushed back at. We try to damp out this initial disturbance. And we have lots of cases of this institutionally. Another example is someone leaves an institution and people say, oh, okay, the existing people are to think about a software development team. Someone gets hired by Google from your software development team. And you say, wow, there's a lot more work for the existing people to do. We were 4 people, now we're 3. We got to hire someone. So you look around and you find someone, you bring them in. That's an example of another negative feedback. The original disturbance, the loss of a person was lessened by the actions taken, right? So there's lots of cases of this. These are, another word we use for these is they're regulatory, meaning that they serve to kind of keep the system around some equilibrium, around some sort of stasis, around some balancing point, okay? Regulatory in character, okay? Sort of negative feedback loops. How about positive feedback loops? Do they keep a system around equilibrium? Grow what? The equilibrium? They grow the system? Okay, the disturbance, yeah. Yeah, they grow the disturbance, the initial disturbance. Give me an example that we've all heard, literally, of a positive feedback loop. Okay, in what sense? Yeah, okay, so good. So microphone feedback, there's a little disturbance. I could almost recreate it here this morning. I recreated it by accident in my wrong class. It was in my 214 class on Unix commands in that lecture, and the insignificance was lost. But you bring a microphone too close to a speaker. The initial sound gets amplified by the speaker. The microphone picks it up, amplifies it further, and you get round and round, and it gets really loud very quickly, even louder than my voice. So that's an example of a positive feedback loop, and generally you might use the word reinforcing here, the reinforcing feedback. Okay, so reinforcing feedbacks are another type, and they tend to lead to instability, tend to lead to a situation where an initial change, imagine someone coming in with Ebola to the Saskatoon airport. One person gets Ebola in Saskatoon, and maybe 2, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16, and it starts amplifying out, right? Now, are these always bad? No, in fact, there are certain engineered systems where we engineer positive feedbacks into them for maneuverability. So, for example, fighter jets, it turns out, have the ability to turn on a dime, turn really quickly because they exploit positive feedback. They take advantage of it so that they can shift very quickly, sort of their direction and so on. So it's not always something we try to suppress. If you're a company, are there certain positive feedbacks you like?
More and more feedback.
Yeah, better and better word of mouth. You have a successful product, a successful service, and more people are impressed with it, and they tell their friends, and get more business, and you can get very, very quick growth. And the hallmark here is that giving a bit of growth. Now we're getting to dynamics associated with it. Giving a bit of growth leads to amplified yet further, and that is amplified yet further, so you get sort of faster and faster growth. Hallmark is it can be exponential, and in most cases, in the short term, it often is a pretty good approximation. For those of you who are comfortable with this, if we write down a differential equation, dx dt, I should probably put it under this so it's clear, dx dt, the rate of change of x, variable x over time. If we kind of linearize it, we may get something proportional to where we could represent it as alpha x to a first order if the change in x is sort of small enough, about some equilibrium. And ladies and gentlemen, this leads to a formula like e to the alpha t. To the degree that this is a good approximation, we can get divergent behavior, amplifying behavior. Over here, we may have a situation where we have dx dt equals, so alpha here is greater than 0, that's a reinforcing feedback. Over here, we may have dx dt equal, and so here we have alpha equals 0. Over here, we have dx dt also equal to alpha x, but this also leads to e to the alpha t, but now alpha is negative. And what does that lead to in terms of, if we draw something where this is negative, if it's less than 0, what is the time behavior of that like? Yeah, it sort of approaches some stasis point. Now, I'm abstracting over a lot of things because I don't want to lose, 3/4 of the class with this. But for those who are comfortable with this, turns out that yes, you can have a constant term up front, but due to a change of variables, you can eliminate the constant term, and you can have this linear term, and for around a certain point, it can be a pretty good approximation. Then you see that sort of behavior. I'm not saying that these behaviors always result from these sort of feedbacks. In fact, we'll see a case in a minute where this approximation breaks down, but fundamentally we do see situations where very commonly it's associated with reinforcing dynamics, at least in the short term, that are exponential, and here declining exponential towards some stasis. So here, if we disturb it, if we sort of pop it up some, we push at it, it pushes back and it goes back down. We push at it and it goes back down. This is like a highly, this might be a situation where like Ebola comes into Saskatoon. Here we might have a situation where we have a highly immunized population and someone comes in, in the 1970s with a population that's really well immunized against chickenpox. They come in, you have people arriving in the Saskatoon airport with chickenpox, you're going to have maybe a little break and then it dies out. A little break, dies out. We'll see why that is, but that's the basic gist of it. So here you have stability. So ladies and gentlemen, stable, these negative ones, and unstable, or unstable, they have instability. Okay? Stable and unstable. Now, what happens when we have a negative feedback but there's a long delay associated with feedback. So maybe you're an institution and you have policies, you're trying to see if you can increase, if you can respond to adverse conditions well, but you don't know, because there's a reporting deadline, you don't know for a year, unless, until after your policies have had an effect, whether they're really having a good effect. What if there's a long delay? Or suppose you're driving on the highway on ice and it takes you a bit of time to realize, that you're overshooting where you want it to go, or your aim is not quite right. What sort of behavior do you get out when you have a situation where we have a negative feedback but with a long delay in observation? Long delay in perception, long delay in reaction. Well, it turns out what we get here is an oscillation. Okay? Often it's a damped oscillation. Why? Well, the system is trying to adapt, but it's adapting with this delay. It's adapting with a lag. It's adapting in a slow way. So it continues in one direction long after that's beneficial, and it overshoots. So we have a situation where we get something like this often. We might get an approach in a good situation to some equilibrium, a sort of overshoot and sort of undershoot, overshoot and undershoot. Or we might get a situation where we simply have a persistent oscillation. So, if you're trying to judge your position, as you're going along in a car on ice, it's easy to fishtail. It's easy to kind of go on one side and go up to the other side and go up to the other side, overcorrect, and you have to correct again, and you get these sort of oscillations. These oscillations are not merely curious things. So, a good colleague of mine, who actually Kurt has spoken with in the back, named Jim Rogers down at the Mayo Clinic, perhaps arguably the U.S.'s top medical institution, using system dynamics, went to the Mayo Clinic to examine some of the challenges that they're experiencing with their dialysis population. Okay? They have a dialysis population, people whose kidneys have failed, and these are people who often die within a very quick time, 2 to 3 years on average is quite common after starting dialysis, and they go through often a variety of really bad symptoms because the medication is off from what they need, and so they get sick and they feel weak and they can't be with their grandkids or whatever, and it's a really difficult existence. Moreover, it's the number one most expensive drug in the American formulary, this drug used to treat these people, and they go through it really quickly. So he, using system dynamics, using this method we'll be learning about, was able to create a little model which showed them how they could simultaneously reduce the amount of drug used, therefore save money, improve the quality of life of the patients by having less fluctuations with them, have longer length of life, so they actually live quite a bit longer, and reduce the amount of work on a doctor so a doctor can manage more patients. And it all had to do, ladies and gentlemen, with this issue of oscillations. Because what was happening is there was a delay. Doctors were giving this patient drug, and they'd look at the patient's blood readings 3 days later, 4 days later. They don't see any improvement. So what do? They give more drug. They look again. Has it improved? Well, they're starting to see a little bit of improvement. Oh, well, it must be a sign this patient really needs a lot of drug. So they give it more drug. More drug. Boost the patient's uptake of the drug. That's all well and good. But this goes on for a couple of weeks, and finally the patient's reaching a normal level. But guess what, folks? Now they start going the other direction because they have too much drug in them. And it turns out that what they found is that the reaction time to this drug, actually to accomplish its effect, it's a reaction time of about 3 weeks. So if you look every few days, you give drug and you see is it having an effect, you're not going to see much because the effect is going to be 3 weeks from now. So you're going to be looking for signs early and you're going to overdo it. You're going to give too much. You're going to think you're going to see effects immediately. You see no effects, you give more, and you end up loading them chock-a-block full of this drug that is going to take them in the other direction very quickly. So after 3 weeks, the patients would go way under. So they weren't seeing this damping thing. They were seeing something more like this. Around this point. This is the desirable point. And they were instead going way up, and they would be terribly sick up here. And they'd be terribly sick down here. Terribly sick up here. Terribly sick down there. It's really terrible. Horrible. Feeling lousy again, no energy, or vomiting, or what have you. And it was hurting their system. Up here, they could have a heart attack really easily because their blood clots very easily. Down here, they may be in a situation where they don't have enough red blood cells to keep them going, and they get all dizzy and faint or fall. And if you're elderly, you can break serious bones, your hips, etc. So they were having these real problems with control of the patients, and the patients were being damaged. They'd have heart attacks, etc. So what they did is they found a way to really, with a system dynamics model, using VenSim, which we're going to be using, they found a way to keep them basically stable by recognizing this long delay and not just overreacting to it. It saved money, saved lives, improved quality of life, saved doctors time, which allowed treatment of more patients. A good thing. Yes?
Is it at all, what I see here is a decaying wave.
Yeah.
And it looks like the sum of two interfering waves.
Mm.
Can you use the frequency math to sort of see
Okay, that's a good question.
the delay? Because it wasn't being delayed. There wasn't a decrease in the amplitude of that wave. It's just staying constant.
Yeah. You're saying, could you use something, in this case, you're saying where it's staying constant?
Yeah, if your delay was instead of 3 weeks, it was 2.5 weeks.
Yeah.
Would that sort of slowly increase?
That's a good question.
Relative things, I don't know.
It might. It has to do with how frequently the doctors meet with the patients and adjust their dose. What the problem was they were meeting with them too frequently. They were adjusting the dose too quickly, in response. And as a result, it caused this. Now, if you're asking the frequency of this, I think the frequency is dictated by the natural frequency, by the time constant associated with how quickly the body's adjusting to that drug, is my guess. But the amplitude is how much drug how much they're sort of keep on giving the drug, when they're
they can control
not
the frequency of their
right.
their
Their observations, yes, and that's what they did. Basically, they had them not react. So turning on the English phrase, "Don't just stand there, do something." Their recommendation is, for this case, don't do something, just stand there. Observe what's going on over a longer period. Don't overreact, because if you overreact, it may worsen the situation. And that fundamental insight is all related to these loops that we're seeing. I might be able to send you a video where he describes that and describes the little model which they built and so on. We actually have an example of this model that's been built here on campus together with Jim, came up last summer, and we may show it to you. We'll probably show it to you later in the semester. Okay. It's a very nice hybrid model. It's system dynamics and agent-based model. But this is an example of sort of oscillations and how failure to understand the cause of oscillations can cause massive problems that affect lots and lots of people. Okay. So we have these kind of modes of behavior coming out of that. That's good. Causal diagrams provide us with a way, even though they're mostly qualitative, even though our diagram might have lots of features in it that are fairly fairly qualitative in nature, it allows us to go and examine phenomena in a sort of